So I sat here yesterday building my slides and I was thinking about what I wanted to title it. So I came up with rebuilding a community, but then I realized I would be a little remiss if I didn't take into account that we did this project. We were rebuilding a community during a global pandemic. I know a lot of times we like to think that maybe it didn't affect our work, but the fact is that it has, and it's okay for us to say that and recognize that this work was hard in the middle of COVID. So we chose an area in Bangor known as the West Side Village. It's one of the oldest neighborhoods in Bangor, and it's also the most highly populated by density in our city. There's over 2,000 residents in this tiny third square mile. I know by a lot of cities that's not very dense, but by Maine standards, that is a very highly dense neighborhood. Some of the challenges that we knew we were going to encounter when we started were poverty. About 81% of the residents who live in this neighborhood fall below the area median income. And it's by far the highest percentage of poverty in any neighborhood in the city. Housing is an issue. Most of the housing in the neighborhood are very old homes that have been chopped up into multiple apartments with rickety staircases. Many of them don't meet code requirements and are unsafe. Additionally, the housing costs are shockingly high for these apartments in this neighborhood. The average rental in this area is about $1,300 a month. The other big challenge we had to face was substance use. This area of town is kind of the epicenter of our opioid crisis. On any given day when you walk down the streets or through the park, you'll find used hypodermic needles or other paraphernalia around. And this area of our city also has the highest rates of overdose in the entire state. In addition to substance use, there's also a lot of other health disparities that come out of this neighborhood. Children living in this area test higher rates of lead poisoning in their blood than other parts of town. And in the middle of the pandemic, we started to notice a very disproportionate amount of COVID cases in this neighborhood, which prompted me to look at some data. I love data, and digging deep into the CDC data, I discovered that while this neighborhood makes up 6.5% of the population of Bangor, 33.5% of our COVID cases were happening in this area, which was a very shocking health disparity. And then the last challenge we had is safety. The number of police calls in this area and crime, much higher than anywhere else. As I mentioned, it has the highest rates of overdose, and it also has the second highest rate of child protective case calls in our city as well. But I don't always like to focus on challenges, so I also thought about the strengths that already existed in this neighborhood that we could build off of as we embarked on this project. The biggest one is the history. This is, as I mentioned earlier, is one of the earliest neighborhoods in Bangor. It was built in the 1800s during the lumber boom. These old homes that I mentioned earlier are all homes built by the lumber barons. They're these big mansions, and they were just beautiful in their day. And up until the 1980s, this was still a very vibrant neighborhood. Children would play in the streets and, make sure they were home when the street lights came on. It was kind of the picture perfect American neighborhood. And then everything started to change. And a fun fact for those of you who may be a fan of Bangor's most famous resident, Stephen King, or are familiar with his book or movie, It. The children from the movie It, that's actually all set in this neighborhood. King changes the name of the town to Derry, but it's Bangor, and so Pennywise lived in the sewer of this neighborhood as well. So one of the other great strengths we had was a really large group of invested stakeholders. there was an already established group who were really, they were already putting into place a lot of things to revitalize the West Side Village. They called themselves the Neighborhood Recovery Initiative, and they consisted of a social service agency that their offices were within the neighborhood. There was a neighborhood community center. Our state and local officials were very invested. We had healthcare providers, mental health care providers, recovery agencies, many business and civic leaders, as well as a lot of people who had recently bought old homes in the neighborhood to renovate. So there was a lot of home renovation experts who were invested in rebuilding this neighborhood too. The other strength was just the people. I think in just about every neighborhood, you can find a core of dedicated neighbors and residents who are really motivated in making their neighborhood a safe and place to live for everybody. Another strength was there is an amazing park in this neighborhood. Bangor is known for its beautiful parks and playgrounds, and this neighborhood was no exception. There was a beautiful park. However, over the last couple decades, it had become filled with a lot of trash. Again, needles and drug paraphernalia littered the ground, and it was often the location for lots of encampments for people experiencing homelessness. And the other strength we had was just the community. In Bangor, we're very fortunate to have a large sense of community, and we all have a shared goal of creating positive and lasting change. And this neighborhood was no different. Everybody was very invested in rebuilding it. You know, we had a great group of people willing to donate time, money, and ideas to make these dreams and plans a reality at the end of the day. So you all may remember a time, well, at least in our area here in Maine, at the end of spring, summer last year, our COVID cases had dropped, and it kind of looked like there was a light at the end of the COVID tunnel. So we knew we could finally, you know, we'd been laying plans for a long time, but we could finally get in there and start doing things. So the first step we had to do was clean up the neighborhood. And we partnered with our local United Way, and we had 75 community volunteers show up one Saturday morning to clean up this park and the neighborhood around it. They filled hundreds of bags of trash, and they collected over 200 needles that were safely disposed of. And this is just a couple pictures of the park. You can see what a beautiful place it is for children, adults, pets, everyone. Also, as part of this community cleanup day, we also had volunteers who built a community garden. We had a group of neighbors who were interested in starting a pilot garden in this neighborhood. And while there had been lots of other successful community gardens throughout Bangor, there had never been one specifically in this neighborhood. And we knew that besides providing food for food insecure households, that this garden would also help build community spirit and promote family time by gardening together and encouraging outdoor activities and all of those things that just help really build a robust neighborhood. I'm proud to say the garden grew great over the summer. It received good care from a handful of residents who tended to it, you know, many days during the week. And they have a lot of interest in doing this again next year. In fact, they want to do it bigger and better. They want to make more beds. And I actually have 2 residents who have reached out to me recently who want to step up and kind of lead the charge of the community gardens and for the neighborhood. So it's great that, you know, I was going to say planted the seeds, but that sounds like a really corny pun. But so we planted the seeds of this garden, and the neighborhood is just kind of running with it. With hopefully, you know, we'll continue to support it financially, but as far as the day-to-day care and everything, they've taken it on for their own at this point. Another thing that happened over the summer, there was another group of residents who were really interested in just making the neighborhood more beautiful. So they went around to Lowe's and Home Depot and lots of greenhouses and got I can't even begin to tell you how many plants and flowers and mulch donated. And they just went around and they planted plants on the sidewalk in front of people's homes who said it was okay. If it was the public space in the median between the sidewalk and the street, they got permission from the city in certain places. They just made it really beautiful. So walking around the neighborhood all of a sudden was inspiring and refreshing instead of, kind of cold and somber. It was really beautiful throughout the summer. I didn't put any slides in here, but there's been some efforts on some community art that's been going up. There's been some murals done, and it's definitely becoming a more welcoming place than it was even just a couple years ago. So you may remember earlier I talked about this park as being one of the benefits of this neighborhood. But it's also, as I mentioned, a challenge. It had become really run down and wasn't the same place that it used to be, or a place where you would want to send your children or maybe hang out yourself. So while this is true, we knew we had to sort of reclaim the park for the neighborhood. And the first steps, as I mentioned earlier, were cleaning it up. This park had become central to the substance use crisis that plagues our city. And anybody just saying the term Second Street Park, it had so much stigma attached to it. Nobody had any good thoughts when they heard the phrase Second Street Park. Ironically, in Bangor, as I talked about, we have all these beautiful parks. This was the only park that didn't have an actual name. It was the only park that was named after the street it was on. All of them have, they're named after people or have other wonderful names. But Second Street Park was the outlier. And like I said, there were no good thoughts when people heard the term Second Street Park. So early on in this process, I was thinking about this one day, and it occurred to me, like, we need to change the name of the park. That's the first step in reclaiming the park after cleaning it up. So, I was looking around at all the other names, and I realized that, these things, they have to go through the municipality, and there's a lot of red tape, and sometimes it takes a really long time to make things happen. So I decided I would just plant a couple seeds with a couple people who I knew had the power to make this change. So I had one conversation with one person, and a couple months later, we had Talbot Park instead of the Second Street Park, which was very exciting. This park was named after Gerald Talbot, who is the gentleman on the left in this photo with the Vietnam veterans hat. Beside him is one of our state legislators. Not only was it great that we changed the name of this park, but that it was named after Gerald. Gerald actually grew up in this neighborhood, and he was the first African-American state of Maine legislator in the entire state. And secondly, he's the first person that the city of Bangor has ever named a park after that's still living. So there's lots of great accolades, and much to his credit, he was thrilled to have this park named after him in his old neighborhood. So what's next for this neighborhood? Like I said, we had this little period of time last summer where we thought we were nearing the end of COVID. And then quickly as fall approached in our area, we have just seen a spike like we have never seen through the pandemic before. We have more cases now than ever, and it continues to grow every month. So we kind of had to scale back our plans, at least temporarily. Some of the things we had planned to have in place already, but still will put in place when it's safe to do so, is there's a community center I had mentioned earlier on in this neighborhood, and we would love to have one of our agency case managers there have open office hours one day a week. We also have a behavioral health navigator on staff who we'll put over there to do some open office hours. Sometimes it's just easier for people walking by or in the neighborhood just to drop in instead of, having to make that phone call and stuff. They can just come in and chat if they need services or not. Sometimes it's just good to talk to somebody who has those resources people might need. So once it's safe again for both our staff and the neighborhood, we will start doing that. We've been exploring some projects using social media to engage the neighborhood as well. But I recognize that there's a lot of inherent risks that come with that, and we really want to mitigate those risks before we fully roll that out. But there's also a lot of benefits. You can really build a sense of community with some neighborhood groups. So if anybody has any success with that, I would love to hear about it as well. But at the end of the day, we just have to accept that even the best laid plans can't compete with a global pandemic that sort of ebbs and flows, and we never know from month to month where we're going to be. But we've certainly learned a lot of new and creative ways to still do our work, still help our communities and ensure the health and safety of everyone in them. And if I had just one piece of advice for anybody taking on a project like this, it's just to find the spark. In every neighborhood, sometimes it's just one person or a small group of people who have that spark to change something. And if you can find them and just build off that, it just makes everything easier, and everything kind of comes together in the end, and we're able to create safer, kinder, and more equitable neighborhoods for our children to grow and thrive. So thank you.